Greetings to our viewers, and today I'm very excited to discuss a snapshot of the Virgin Islands Secondary School under Principal Carlisle Scott. And today we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Catherine Smith, the Director of Culture, Editor Mrs. Medita Malone Wheatley, and Mr. Bennett Smith, who both were students of Mr. Carlisle Scott during his tenure as principal. And today we're going to have this discussion and we'll have some first-hand accounts, given that you were both students at the Virgin Islands Secondary School at the time. But before we get into this discussion about the text in question today, let's turn to Dr. Smith. And Dr. Smith, can you tell us about the Department of Culture's responsibility in promoting literary arts in particular, and how this specific book you think is correlating, and the promotion of this book will correlate with the goals of the department?
Yes, the Department of Culture, of course, has a keen interest in the literary arts, but frankly, all of the arts. But in the literary arts, this book launch program is one that's a long-standing program. So it's very important for us to be able to promote and market the books of our local authors. But I just want to speak about this book in particular. So when I first started reading the book, it was with a really pleasant kind of surprise that I realized that really this book was speaking to me about an entire community or society that was developed almost through education. And I say that because you could almost see the building blocks, or, the old adage, the ones on whose shoulders we stand, by just looking at the names and the brief notes that were made in the book about what those students had done, so that I saw so many of even my mentors in there. I know everyone would see their mentors in this book. So it just stood out to me that when we have a book like this, we really connect education to building society or building a community.
Right.
At least that's one of the key messages that I took away from the book, and I'm sure that there are many more. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Smith. And we will definitely touch on that a bit later, the importance of education
Yeah.
and how it contributes to the overall development of
Yeah.
any society.
Yes.
So thank you, Dr. Smith. And now, Mrs. Wheatley, first of all, let me say congratulations in your role in editing a critical text like this. Can you tell our viewers what this book is about and how you were led to completing a work such as this?
Well, thank you. This book is about the vision and the mission of Mr. Scott in his role as principal between 1956 and 1968. To me, it has been a long time in coming, because Mr. Scott died about 17 years ago, I was reminded this week. And his vision for this book came to the fore about a year or so before he died. And he had already written an account of what he had done in great detail, fortunately. And he asked me to collect contributions from other students and teachers from the school. And unfortunately, before we were able to get a significant number of contributions, he passed away. And because Elton Georges was the one he had tasked with the responsibility of writing the foreword, the two of us worked on it together. And then sadly, Mr. Georges passed away. And we didn't really have the time to discuss
Right.
how we would move forward with it. But I took on the responsibility of seeing it through to the end.
Great. Well, well, thank you for ensuring that it was indeed completed. And I know that one of the prominent themes within the text is nostalgia. So, can you reflect on who Mr. Carlisle Scott was to you, and what do you think that his impact was? And then afterwards, we'll have Mr. Smith to actually weigh in on this a bit as well.
Well, I think in the life of every student who has succeeded to whatever degree, there is some person who has been prominent in that student's life. And for me, that person was Mr. Scott. He had a tremendous impact on my life at an important stage of my development. I came to meet him when I was 11 plus, and I was in school for 5 years. And he taught my favorite subjects. So he wasn't just the principal, he was my teacher. And the examinations that I did for Cambridge were of his subjects. And I can remember the smile on his face when we were crowding around him and he was looking at the results, and he looked at me and he smiled and he said, "You passed my Latin." Yes, I won't ever forget that. He has had such an impact on this community. So I think of him as a hero. And Mrs. Scott Yolan, his wife, used to say that those of us who attended that school were Mr. Scott's children. Well, if he had children, he also had grandchildren.
Right.
And so we are seeing today his impact, not only through the students whom he taught, but through their children. And I believe it will continue to touch this community for generations to come.
Thank you, Mrs. Wheatley. Mrs. Smith, can you also, tell us about the impact that Mr. Scott would have had on your life?
Well, first of all, I agree with most of what Mrs. Wheatley says. As far as, in general terms, the effect on students in general. Personally, for me, I look at myself and my situation back in those days, like 1956, and I can say that I had little interest. I went to school because they sent me to school. I had to go. My parents made me go.
Right.
I was not a hard-working student. Definitely, I was not a hard-working student. I had to do the subjects. I did them, and apparently, I had good memory, so I could memorize a lot of stuff, and I did reasonably well, to the extent that Mr. Scott thought I was quite capable. He, as I can recall, I think he only did one subject with me, and that was religious knowledge. And I know he taught Latin and other things. I didn't do Latin. I did Spanish, which was done by other students. But as I said, generally, I think he looked at persons like myself, at least that's the way I see it, and he saw potential that we didn't care about. I had absolutely no interest, it was more, not so much only interest. I didn't foresee myself going into tertiary education or anything like that. It was something that I hardly knew about and was hardly concerned about. And in fact, just to mention the overall effect that he had on students. Before, I think before my time, the only student I know who went directly from secondary school, Virgin Island High, BVI, was it? Virgin Island Secondary School, to college, was Elton George's. He went to Canada. Dr. Orlando Smith and myself, we went into the sixth form, which is something that I guess most people wouldn't imagine that back in 1960 and thereabouts, we had a sixth form.
Right.
But he had both of us sit in the sixth. Well, Elton, of course, went into the sixth form. Walwyn Bruley went into the sixth form. Then Elton Georges went into the sixth form. Then Orlando and myself went into the sixth form. We stayed in the sixth form for 3 years. Corinne Bruley, I think, came after, and maybe one or two others. Corinne, unfortunately, she died during that period. One of the issues at that time was that UWI existed, but you couldn't get into UWI without 2 A levels and a foreign language. So that said immediately that as the secondary school was organized, you couldn't get into UWI. You had to go someplace else. Mr. Scott saw it a little differently. He thought we could do it.
Right.
And again, I mean, I had absolutely interest. I was a little fella. I was young. I was, like 15 years old, 14, 15. And he said, you can do it. And we did it. And I'm saying that because he saw something that I would say 95% of the people in this country didn't see. He saw potential. He saw where we could grow, we could go off and be like, equal with anybody else anywhere in the world. We never saw that. I mentioned that Elton was the first person who went directly from secondary school, but people from BVI did not go to college unless you went to the States or someplace. My sister Janet went to she left fifth form, she went to 12th grade in St. Thomas, and then she went to Inter-American in Puerto Rico. But before that, nobody went any place. I mean, before Georges, nobody went any place. And he saw that we could go places. And I think that's what made him different. It wasn't because we had the urge to do it, but he saw it. And he convinced our parents that we could do it. And I think that was essentially a turning point. Because after that, I wouldn't call it the floodgates. But after that, students started going off. I think Mrs. Wheatley here went off to UVA, college, CVA.
I went to sixth form in Antigua.
In Antigua,
and
there you
then
go.
I went to Barbados.
Right.
Clearville.
But Mr. Scott made that difference. Before he started doing that, it just simply didn't happen. Nobody left high school secondary school in Todd and went to college or sixth form or any other advanced education. It just didn't happen.
It just didn't happen at that time. Okay, so Mrs. Wheatley, I know that you yourself, you're an educator. What would you say to current generations of teachers and persons who are in those positions of influence to the youth, in terms of how they can formally and informally, especially to instill and inspire self-belief and discipline and those things? What would you say to those teachers?
Well, Mr. Scott was very serious about his mission. And he communicated that to us in a lot of different ways, including his little stick that he would use if we didn't do our homework. Yes. And I recall during our, when the parents used to come at the end of the year, I recall Mr. Scott saying to them, the students of the BVI can do just as well as students anywhere. He was ambitious for his students.
He had high hopes.
Yes.
Right.
And he, you will see that in the notes that he made in the book.
All right. So we're encouraging everyone, but specifically teachers, to pay attention to those notes. There are a lot to be learned and garnered from his personal notes?
He made sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that when Marguerite was a baby, he brought her to school with him.
Oh, wow.
Hmm That's how committed he was.
Right. And this is an edited work. So this means that there are contributions by more than one person. And within the text, there are testimonials about persons who would have interacted with Mr. Scott during his tenure. A person saying nice things that we heard Mr. Smith mentioning as well, about how he inspired a certain level of confidence in his students and so on. Can you tell us if you found from your research and from compiling those accounts, if there were any like commonalities or common values that you heard recurring about Mr. Scott?
Well, one thing was the seriousness of his mission. A number of persons would have mentioned that, and he instilled discipline, and they would have mentioned that as well. Discipline, you can't do without it in a school system that succeeds.
Right.
And we have to, I don't know how we would get back to the place where we are disciplined, not only in terms of behavior, but in our approach to learning.
Right.
And in our love of learning, he inspired that. And I think that that is something for which many people would have been grateful and would have mentioned. Those who contributed, they would have mentioned that.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Smith, I think that's an appropriate place for us to have a discussion about, like certain cultural values that would have led and contributed to, discipline and how that has been, changing over time. What do you think can happen to kind of preserve some of the values and, as they pass on from generation to generation, so that like intergenerational relay of information and passing on values? What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first I just wanted to quickly congratulate Mrs. Medita Malone Wheatley on editing the text, and also the contributors who contributed to it.
Right.
I also wanted to pick up on something that actually was one of the main, that was just talked about, that was one of the main things I noticed. It really did stand out to me when the sentences that said, Mr. Scott told us that we could be as good as other students in the Caribbean. It really actually stood out to me a lot, because I just want to speak a little bit on the importance of these kinds of books, because I think we've talked before about the first-hand account.
Yes.
So like if we do a history of education, we won't really get that kind of rich experience, that lived experience that Mrs. Wheatley can write of in the book, or the other contributors in the first-hand way can speak of. We won't understand that dynamic, that, that there was a something there that needed to happen, where he had to fill that void and have Virgin Islanders as young people feel that time that in education they could be as good as the other Caribbean islands. So that says a whole lot about our social history, our cultural history, social especially, and where we have come from. And just that simple statement should really lead to a lot more in terms of what is that? How did that happen? What is our stage of development compared to the other Caribbean islands? I think Mr. Scott came from Barbados. I don't know if that was
yes.
right. So it just tells you a lot about the development of the Virgin Islands and the exact, experience, but also the feelings. Like, what would that have felt like to, discover that you could do this and you could be as good as I think that is so profound. And I just wanted to mention that a little bit, because it did stand out to me in terms of that. So it just makes you know that his legacy and what he came here to do was he saw that, and he saw there was a need to do that. It seems at every turn with the discipline, and and you said he made his mission known. right? And that he did have that impact. I also want to say that, well, you know, he would have there are grandchildren and great grandchildren of his legacy, but you know, what is their legacy going to say? I mean, Mrs. Medita Malone Wheatley here. I feel like she right now, after her entire contribution to the society, in that book, you see she's a senior lecturer at HLSCC. I feel like Mrs. Wheatley is the kind of lecturer. If I don't know if you ever knew a student that may have dropped out of school, that hates school, that is sitting on the block. I'm saying that if that student ended up in Mrs. Wheatley's class at the college, you would see this complete transformation. And I don't know if there are many lecturers that, and I've seen it, I've heard about it. I don't know if there are many that, and that comes from your entire legacy. We don't even want to begin with Mr. Bennett Smith of Public Works and what it took to physically develop the Virgin Islands at those periods in time. So I just wanted to say that, you know, to me, it's we know of his legacy, but then it goes on, and to me, it really stood out in the book, the legacy of his children. I would say Mrs. Wheatley would have said his children or his grandchildren or great grandchildren. I just wanted to say that before.
Yes.
Yes,
right,
but you did have a.
It was very appropriate. Yes.
Yeah.
So I was just talking about the importance and value that was placed on discipline by Mr. Scott, and you know, some of the changes that have been happening you know, recently and so on, in terms of how discipline is prioritized in schools and so on. You know, can you talk about that from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, because I think that probably Mrs. Wheatley would speak from an education perspective, having gone through the entirety of that experience. From a cultural perspective, that's why I'm going to bring it up again. That's why we have our national cultural policy from last year. That's why enshrined in that policy is the idea of preserving our heritage. And cultural heritage includes the intangibles, which means the values, all of the art forms that come through to you through time. And the paradigm we're following in the policy is that it's only preserved when young people practice those things, when they're fully immersed, understand, are aware, and practice those things. So the question would really be, how do we get from A to B in terms of, one, preserving them and articulating them in a clear way, but then also the programs or activities that it will take, the promotion, that it will take to ensure that young people are aware of and are actually practicing those values. Right. So to me, I would say that, as the policy says, that it will take an entire community. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. To have the exchange. And when I say exchange, is important that the communication between present generations and past generations is like an open dialogue.
Yeah.
Right?
I would say so. Definitely. Okay. Yeah. Has to be.
Yeah. So I just want to go back to what we were talking about. I know we had specific references to individuals about, the impact of educators on your life specifically, Mrs. Wheatley, and on your life as well. But can you tell us about what you think is, the overall impact of educators and those educators who are serious about what they're doing, what's the overall impact on the territory? And Mrs. Smith, you can weigh in as well.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question, because I had asked Miss Dorothy Turnbull to be involved, and she couldn't, but she told me, tell them that teachers touch lives.
Wow.
Teachers touch lives. Mm-hmm. Teachers can make or break an individual, and by the same token, a country.
Mm-hmm.
Because in order to develop the kind of intellectual discipline that is needed for scholarship, there's a certain kind of process that you have to go through. And regardless of what the new fads are, for example, AI, you have to go through that process because it has an impact on your brain. And I'm aware that I was fortunate in my training and my experiences. So it is something that I understand. I don't understand a whole lot of things,
Right.
but I understand that. And I insist on having my students go through a certain process because I know what it can do for them. So I resist the changes that are suggested in modern day classrooms. And I keep on wondering what we can do to ensure
Right.
that things are done the right way.
Thank you, Mrs. Wheatley. You know, we are all beneficiaries of formal education. So, in your view, Mrs. Smith, how do you think educators are, you know, in what capacity are they nation builders as well?
Well, first of all, I see a tremendous difference between those days, as far as education was concerned, when Mr. Scott was involved, and today. If we take the specific case of the secondary school, the classes were very small, they were very selective. We didn't have the comprehensive school. I don't know what percentage of the school population got into the secondary school, but the secondary school itself was probably like 150 strong at the most, maybe between 100 and 150 strong.
Right.
So you get the idea that I don't want to use the term, but in terms of I would say, or abilities, we were probably a somewhat elite group. That's a strange word, but that's probably what it was. And discipline obviously was easier to manage as far as Mr. Scott was concerned. He had more at his disposal. The tamarind rod was there, and he used to keep a fresh supply. And nobody questioned the application. If he applied it, then that was a shameful thing to you. Your parents, you'd try and make sure your parents never learn about it. You couldn't do things like that today. That existed. And there was a mention of the impact of teachers. Well, even before we can go to the impact, if you look at the status of teachers in society in those days, even though, and let me say this, that the secondary education in BVI was by then very new and probably in the experimental stage. I don't think it was 10 years old when Mr. Scott took over. Maybe somebody could tell me, but I don't think secondary education in BVI was 10 years old.
It started in 1943.
43. Okay, right. So it was just about 12, 13 years. So that is also significant because, and I think before him, it was fairly, maybe he developed it to a point where I said that he actually looked at sending people to tertiary education. That had never been done before. But teachers, if I go back to what I said before, teachers had status in a society. There were primary schools, we didn't have secondary schools, but teachers were honored and respected. It's not like today. I mean, they were, in any village, the teacher was somebody special. Our teachers were somebody special. And of course, that had some effect on how we saw education and how the population saw education and the way that children, and discipline, because you were going to be under the control of somebody who was well respected in society, and you didn't go there to fool around. You know, that's the society reinforced that. I don't think it's exactly the same thing. Just again, I mean, without knowing much about education, in Mr. Scott's day, I'd never heard the word suspension. Mm-hmm. We didn't have those gentle punishments, suspension. What nonsense is that? I mean, yeah, we used to have to write lines, and if you had homework to do and you didn't do it, there was punishment. Mr. Scott would say to me, well, Ben Smith, if you don't do your work at home, you'll do it in school. And then I have to stay in after school and do it. And he didn't have to get my parents' permission to do that. In fact, I would have to explain why I'm late getting home. I suppose Mrs. Wheatley here couldn't do that because she had to catch a bus, so she would have to walk, but he probably held as long as she could. So I think the attitude was completely different. And as somebody not involved in education, it's difficult for me to make, accurate comparisons except what I see from a distance.
Understood.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really, really valued education, even though it was supposedly at a lower level. As I said, it was a very small group, and only a few got in there. So if you went in there, you didn't go in to fool around. You went in to work hard.
Well, thank you for that.
I would like to add something else that Mr. Scott was very serious about. Every day we had devotions to set the tone for the day.
Isn't that still standard?
Well,
I don't know. I thought they still do it.
well, he was very serious about it.
He
would
was very
put on his
intentional.
robe.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And it meant a great deal to me, coming from the Methodist tradition, where we were suffused with God and Bible and everything from infant school through elementary and even up to secondary school.
Right.
Right. We had to pray when we go in the mornings. We had to pray when we going for lunch, and we had to pray when we were dismissed in the afternoon. Isn't it? I think we did all that. Lord dismiss us with thy blessing and whatnot.
Okay. That's interesting. But one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that it has multiple perspectives, and the subject himself also has notes within the text. So you get to hear from him, and you get to hear from persons who would have interacted with him. So I think that, there's very interesting, dynamic at play. Before we go on to speak about the book launch, which is going to be on May 6th, which is Monday, next Monday.
Yes.
I'm just going to give you the opportunity, Dr. Smith. I know you would have made some very valuable contributions earlier on, but at this juncture, if you would like to ventilate any more ideas or ask any questions to our panelists, you can do so now.
Yes. Two small questions for the viewing public. You mentioned the Virgin Islands secondary school and then a Virgin Islands high school. So I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the two. It seems that the high school came after the secondary school.
Yes. In 1968, there was the introduction of the comprehensive school system. So Mr. Scott was the principal of that system for 2 years.
Okay.
And later on, we had another principal. He came to us from Jamaica, Calvin Wallace. But Mr. Scott was principal of both schools.
So the high school, was it an amalgamation of secondary school and junior high, or what was different about the high school than the secondary school?
In the secondary school, we had to do the 11 plus exam, and only about 20 or so persons.
Yeah, I think probably the key word is comprehensive, because that was a term that was used, that we went from the highly selective secondary school to what we call the comprehensive school. I'm not sure what that meant, but I think that's what made a difference. And suddenly, instead of having 150 to 200 students, we had closer to 2,000. So, that
access
was...
for many.
And I mean, I'm not, so that's why I pointed out that we had a kind of nicely selective little school, and it worked well. But then, of course, we saw that a lot of our people were not being developed to their full potential because they didn't have the opportunity.
You know what I really love on that topic there? I loved the country boy section in here. I'm talking about Ruben Vanderpool and brother, and how they talked about coming, being the country boys, coming for the country. And as you talked about comprehensive education, it made me think about everything we talk about during H. Lavely Stout Day, which is the access
Yeah,
that was
right.
brought into everyone, not just say Rotown or selected others.
Access is the key. I said
Yeah.
comprehensive, but I think
Yeah.
access is the key word.
Yeah.
Did Ruben tell you that they used to ride donkeys to school? But that's another story.
He might have written that in his
Oh, yeah.
But another thing that was different is that, as far as I'm aware, the students who came to the comprehensive school in those first years didn't have to do examinations in order to get in.
Right. I wouldn't. I think so, but I don't know for sure.
I was aware at the time,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
because I had a sister who went in, I
Yes.
know that she didn't have to do an examination
Yes.
in order to get in.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting because I saw the year. So the 1956 to 1968 would have captured his time both at the secondary school and the high school, or
58, you say, or 68? 68.
1956 to 1968.
68. Yeah. Just
So what were the time periods again?
But he left in 1970 because he was with the comprehensive
Okay.
school from 68 to 70.
Okay,
Yes.
understood.
And my other quick question for the viewing public now is the location.
I was wondering about
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Where was it located for the viewing public?
Close to the area where the Dawson Superette is,
Okay.
along that area.
Okay.
But
In Lower
Mr. Scott
State. Mhm.
gives a good description of it in the book,
Okay.
so we can tell where everything was located.
Okay.
And one of the things I mentioned in the book with regret is that there's nothing to market.
Yes, you did. I noticed that.
There's nothing to
Yeah.
market.
Because there is on Main Street about the 1940.
Yeah,
the first
experiment,
1943. I think you said.
I say experiment. but
Right,
then-
and I noticed that. So you're talking about Dawson Superette in Lower Estate. Yeah.
Well, it's the campus, the high school campus now includes the secondary school grounds, the primary school grounds, and I think a part of the agricultural station, I believe. Yes.
Yes.
And a part of the agricultural station.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there was a pasture between the school and the gut. You know, so the actual school grounds didn't go all the way across. So it's been expanded. We took in the primary school area and we moved the primary school to somewhere else. Where did we move it to? I don't remember.
Over by where the place where we have all the events now.
Oh.
That became the Altus Catholic School.
Barrier Hall
okay.
over in that
Yes.
area.
You mean, because what I was thinking is, you remember they used to refer to the primary school as the long school.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the high school was just next to it, but it was one area, and and we had between the schools and the road there was a nice big open play area, and all that is taken up in buildings now. But the schools weren't this close to say the well. It was quite a distance between the actual buildings and Sunday morning well.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
as I mentioned earlier, nostalgia is really a prominent theme in the book, and we see it coming out here as well. So at this time, Dr. Smith, can you tell us about the launch? Give us some details about that. I know that this launch is kind of unique in the sense that it gives like a reunion type
Yes.
feeling, to those persons who will be in attendance.
Yes. So the launch itself is on Monday. Everyone is invited, of course. On Monday, May
May
what's
6th.
the 6th of May at 5 p.m. And where's the location? The location is in lecture room number 2 at the Elmore Stout High School.
Right.
So, but the junior high, the Ella Dorothy Turnbull building. So it's closest to the entrance, and you go down the stairs. So it's in lecture room number 2. And what we want is for everyone to attend. Everyone is invited, but in particular, we're hoping that all of the students that Mrs. Wheatley listed would be able to attend. And so if you're listening to this interview and you know that you are a student of Mr. Carlisle Scott, please attend this launch or keep your eye out for your invitation, which will be coming very, very, very soon. And we just want to be sure that it's something very special, and it's very fitting that it's special just because of the man and his legacy, and then just the legacy, or what I'm thinking of is the building blocks of our community today, of those persons who would be in attendance. And then even through this book, just the development of a society. It becomes, it's something that, and even the physical aspect of that, how did it look at this point, and now how does it look at that point? It just tells you a lot. So Monday, the 6th of April at 5 p.m. at lecture room number 2 at the Ella Dorothy Turnbull building at the Elmore Stout High School.
Yeah. Now, Mrs. Wheatley, I'm sure for persons who are listening and viewing this interview, they would want to know, oh, where can I get my copy of a snapshot of the Virgin Islands Secondary School under Carlisle Scott? So can you tell us a bit about how we can purchase the book?
Well, apart from coming to the launch and getting it there, you can contact Margaret Scott, that's Mr. Scott's daughter, or you could contact me.
Okay. Right. So are you currently preparing for the launch?
Yes. I wanted to be kind of in the background, but I agreed to speak on behalf of Mr. Scott's family.
Right.
For me, has been a labor of love, a sacred trust. And I am glad that we were able finally to get to this point.
Right. And, I would just like to, personally thank you for ensuring that this work came to fruition, because I can see the significance and the influence that it will have, for a wide cross section of persons, educators, students, and just anyone who are now beneficiaries of the legacy of Mr. Scott, indirectly or directly. And I would also like to thank Mr. Smith. Thank you so much for contributing today and reflecting on your time as a student under Mr. Scott. And of course, Dr. Smith, Director of Culture, thank you so much for joining us. And again, congratulations to you, Mrs. Wheatley. And we hope to see more, from you and hear more from you as well.
I will do my best.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. For the Department of Information and Public Relations, I have been your GIS host, Sanjay Greenwich. Thank you for viewing.